Another beautiful story that began in the Winter Duchy. And there, within its walls, truly terrible things were happening that day. People were watching a beating. An unusual one, considering the main performer was a woman beating a man. She beat him until he bled, sparing neither her strength nor her cruel words. She herself was already splattered with blood. A soulless gaze, and words that struck just as hard as her fists. She told him he shouldn't dare open his mouth. Ignorant fool. He endured it. He couldn't stay silent, no matter how much it hurt just to open his mouth, because he didn't understand. He didn't understand because the girl had sworn she loved him. And now what? What now? Why was she acting so vile, so painfully cruel? The people around them began to chatter. Oh yes, the rumors were true after all. She repeated his words about love one more time, as if tasting the word itself. A smile touched only the corner of her lips. Then she laughed, loudly, shamelessly. She said he was an idiot for believing the nonsense she'd fed him. She'd just been playing around, that was all. She called him filthy and said that in the future he should remember this. Foolish games should never knock him off his path. Well, 10 years had passed since those events. Now, in the house of the woman who had tormented that guy, the servants were carrying on an affair. They were pressed right up against her portrait. Ignorant fools. And they were gossiping about her while indulging in their indecency, kissing, doing it all deliberately, to disgrace her honor. They had forgotten their place. To make matters worse, that filthy scoundrel fantasized aloud, saying his lover looked like her, like the woman in the portrait. The man dreamed that one day he would force her face to twist the same way. But he didn't have to wait long for the witch, as they called her. There she was, the main heroine, the head of the Winter family. Evelyn Winter. A beautiful, cruel woman whose beauty blinded everyone who saw her. They collapsed before her like insects. Having shown such disrespect, doing it right there, they deserved punishment. She said it was too late to beg for mercy once she had judged it a mortal sin. And yet, this woman still showed mercy. She offered them a choice: die quickly with a single shot, or freeze to death. Of course, those bold scoundrels didn't stop begging for forgiveness. Too late, freaks. There was none for them. The woman didn't even flinch at their screams. She never doubted she could do this to them. They even begged Isaac, her servant, for forgiveness when they saw him approaching. But he did so only to shove the man into his proper place, down below, at her feet. That man, Joseph, tumbled down the stairs and landed straight on his head. Maybe that would knock some sense into him. A good lesson, at least. The woman didn't lower her weapon. She was amused by how pitiful those degenerates looked now. She showed yet another rather remarkable mercy. She said their graves would be adorned with gold. They started running away, screaming about how much they hated her, calling her a murderer, a witch, and worse. They wished her to burn in hell. Funny. That's when she really fired, enough that even if they didn't fall, they were thoroughly terrified. She let them run. She shot to scare them, driving them forward. Foolish weaklings, but they received their punishment, whatever one might call it. The woman handed over the gun. She said it was terribly old-fashioned, that's why she missed. The servant also informed her that the ship would be delayed because it had completely frozen over. She only asked how badly, and, if possible, suggested paying the workers extra. Suddenly, the woman heard her maids shouting. She stopped. What now? It turned out that little Lady Sherry had run out of the castle. Sherry, the daughter of the heroine. The girls apologized for not keeping an eye on her. The woman handed her cane to a servant and asked the little girl if she was frightened. She began to gently soothe her, not at all like the way she had just punished those scoundrels. She must have scared her child by firing the gun, loud noises. The woman lifted the child into her arms and explained that she had only been scaring away a wolf that had sneaked onto their land. She even forgot about her cane, so completely absorbed was she in her daughter. She asked little Sherry what she had drawn today. She knew her daughter loved drawing, so she was expecting new artwork. The girl showed her mother a flower. But such flowers didn't grow there. Evelyn assumed she had seen it in a book, and she was right. It turned out the girl had wanted to give this drawing to her mother all along. For some reason, she remembered events from long ago. Very long ago. Back when a boy had carved a flower for her in the atelier. He said it was fine if she didn't like it. She could throw it away if she wanted. But he hid the fact that his hands were covered in cuts. The girl had looked at the flower with genuine interest. The boy said that, for some reason, he really wanted her to see what he had made. Evelyn replied that the flower was actually very beautiful. She liked it. The only sad thing was that the flower, unfortunately, had no scent. Even so, it was beautiful. The boy exhaled in relief. He promised that someday, things would be different. He said a day would come when he would bring her a real flower, just as beautiful, and fragrant too. And he could no longer keep that promise when his sincere feelings were betrayed. Every blow struck his heart harder than his body, leaving twice as much blood and scars. Well, it was only a fleeting memory, nothing more. She went inside with the girl, promising that someday she would find her such a flower. She hoped their peaceful life would remain unchanged long enough for them to someday enjoy flowers together. And faith in a good life can shatter in an instant. A man burst in, saying they had run into unexpected trouble. It turned out that all the sailing, their supplies that had just arrived, had been subjected to a thorough, special inspection. The woman was surprised to hear that armed officials had found something highly explosive on the ships. All the transport ships were confiscated. Someone had decided to strike the woman right in the gut. She hadn't the slightest idea who could have done such a thing. The man, her servant, reported that it was none other than Gilas Black, a colonel of the Altaric army, a war hero who had played a major role in the Battle of Binweli. The woman asked why he would even do this. The man suggested that the war hero suspected the ships of supplying weapons to the enemy army. He asked Milady to be vigilant and especially careful, since no one knew what tomorrow might bring. After all, that man was the devil himself. But there was no need to wait for tomorrow. The war hero was already here. He had come for revenge, to destroy the harmony she had hoped to continue living in. They could have lured her out, but the man chose a proper greeting instead. First, you come in and say hello. Everything by the book. Though they came to greet her in a rather aggressive way, which was hardly surprising. Everyone seemed scared to death. Everyone except Evelyn, which again was no surprise. She wasn't exactly expecting it, but she wasn't shocked either. They even pointed their weapons at the woman. Even so, her gaze was fixed only on him. The man who burst in said that although the greeting turned out dirty, there'd been no time to clean his boots. She was to receive him, an unexpected guest, properly. The man asked if she was indeed the great Duchess, the very one who had once humiliated him, scorned love, betrayed it, revealing herself to be a heartless girl. Back then, when he lay bleeding at her feet, he had sworn he would force her regret. Someday, in the future. Until the very end, the woman couldn't quite make out what he, so pitiful back then, was saying, muttering under his breath. It turned out the boy had vowed that she would regret it for the rest of her life. His love burned out quickly, giving way to hatred and a thirst for revenge. Now he was no longer a ragged, miserable boy. He greeted her as a war hero. He said it had been a long time, and that he was glad to meet again an old acquaintance, the one who had opened his path. The woman trembled slightly, just a little. She was surprised. For her, the meeting was almost nostalgic. He removed his hat, showed her respect, and addressed her by her title, new since the last time they met, Mrs. Winter. The men represented His Majesty. They informed her that the Winter Duchy was suspected of supplying weapons to the enemy army. They politely requested that all members of the family take part in the investigation so everything could proceed properly. The servants began whispering, panicking, not knowing where to go. Panic settled into her home like an unwanted neighbor. They threatened arrest. It was Evelyn who calmed everyone down. She, the powerful Duchess, told them to finally stop making noise. They'd caused enough chaos already. She told the war hero not to try to smear her family name over old, foolish grudges. The woman asked a maid to bring her tea. There was a lot to think about. She was far from pleased with what had happened in her home. All of them, those bastards, were just looking for a chance to get at her name. And she would not let them. Not ever. The war hero watched coldly. The mission of revenge had begun. From that moment on, the game started. Terrifying, bloody, and damn long. A bit of history. The kingdom of Altaric possesses a formidable army, capable of standing against any other. Once, like a comet, a folk hero appeared. A war hero. A commoner who rose incredibly high. Kilas Black. The nameless hero, the black beast, the devil of war. A filthy killer. His way of waging war was like a game of chess. Just imagine, a commoner who had nothing became the hope of an entire country. Hell of a thing. As she was enjoying her tea, the man asked where Sir Rowan Winter was, where her husband was now. The woman asked him to repeat himself, as if she hadn't heard. So he clarified that he was looking for the man she had once married. She exhaled heavily, asked why he even needed that information, and besides, couldn't he read? How else had he become a war hero? The man replied that yes, according to the documents, Rowan had died long ago. But the documents didn't match reality. They had opened his grave, and there was no body inside. The woman froze, teacup still in her hand. What had she just heard? She was stunned by such audacity. Imagine, a mere commoner digging up her husband's grave. He agreed it was rude and could be considered vandalism. But that wasn't the only suspicious detail. She had married him 10 years ago. 3 years later, he supposedly died in a railway accident. He said that yes, it was listed as her husband's death, but no one had seen anything related to the body, and the grave was empty. And after Rowan's death, the flow of money no longer matched the records. A vanished husband, missing funds. Now he wanted to ask directly. Hadn't Rowan Winter staged his own death to prepare an act of treason against the state? She went completely still. What a story he'd come up with. The woman even laughed, catching them slightly off guard. She had almost started to worry with the atmosphere he'd created, but this? She asked whether he'd ever considered becoming a writer instead of a war hero. He had quite the imagination. And now, the war hero with a vivid imagination asked why, after so many years of solitude, she had never remarried. The woman took a sip of her tea. Calmly, without any rush, she replied that she still loved him, even after Rowan was gone. She repeated it once more, and it sounded like the truth, as if she truly had loved him. Then Kilas let out a heavy breath, lowering his head. He didn't really believe her. And after a few seconds of thought, he said it was funny. The man said he didn't believe that a devil like her could ever love anyone. Love? Yeah, right. He couldn't buy it. While he was standing there, the woman lifted her cup and tipped it straight over Gilas's head. She said she didn't find it funny at all. He wasn't surprised. He turned to face her. She told him that if he thought she was scared, he was wrong. A small squad wasn't enough to corner her. She said that if he wanted to make assumptions, he should stop smearing her husband's honor and find real proof. And if he wanted, he could even try to find Rowan himself. As he was leaving, she told him she wouldn't tolerate her time being wasted on foolish suspicions, so he should get out. As the woman walked away, she noticed her on the stairs. Her daughter, sweet Sherry. The mother asked if she was badly frightened. After all, even though everything had happened so suddenly, the girl could stay calm and not be afraid. Apparently, that wasn't what confused the child. Behind her mother stood a man, one who looked terrifying to Sherry. Even the woman flinched when he suddenly spoke from behind her. Who sneaks up like that? It turned out he had come back because he had forgotten to tell her something. The woman didn't want to hear anything else, especially since he had just scared her and ruined her mood even more. The man said that on a ship bound for the enemy country, weapons had been found bearing her family name and seal. If she couldn't prove it was a lie, she should prepare for execution. The woman smiled. She said he had changed a lot. Now he was even making threats. She jabbed him in the chest with her cane and said he could, like before, fall to his knees and cry. Maybe then she'd feel like answering his questions. But the man was no longer the fool he once was. He grabbed her cane and tore it from her hands, sharp and rough. Still, he didn't let her fall. He caught her and held her by the shoulders, speaking more quietly. He glanced at little Sherry. He warned the woman that she was still very young, and he asked that, if not for herself, then at least for her daughter, she should try to be more careful. It was hard to tell whether it was a warning or a threat. After that, he let her go and said they weren't saying goodbye, since they would see each other again. Definitely tomorrow. Finally, the woman was left alone with her daughter, who ran up to her and clutched her dress. The woman watched him walk away, frowning, her face flushed. So, Duke Winter was one of the founders of the Kingdom of Altaric and its most loyal servant. He received lands in the north and grew rich through mining and the military industry. But there was a problem. Blinded by wealth, the Duke's family began expanding their lands through illegal means. It was Rowan who cleansed the family of that corruption. He was the youngest graduate in the kingdom. An adopted child, he stirred plenty of controversy among the people. Later, he disappeared. Died. Only his wife remained, Evelyn Winter. And she chose to continue the inhuman expansion of territory. Of course the people rebelled. How could a woman stand at the head of a family alone? And on top of that, everything became far too expensive. But Evelyn only kept laughing, straight in the faces of everyone who hated her or spread rumors. The problem was that the business that had flourished for so long suddenly slowed down. There was no heir. And just like that, the prestige of the duchy sank to the bottom. That was how she ended up sitting across from the war hero at the table. The man, just imagine, offered to buy her land and her family name. The documents were already prepared. He informed her that all her assets would be confiscated and she herself would be relieved of all responsibilities. It was time for her to rest. The woman answered immediately, rudely told him she didn't need money. What he was offering was a joke. The man went on. Gold production had dropped, and after the incident with supplying weapons to the enemy, future profits could no longer be guaranteed. He suggested ending everything now. No need to bury herself any deeper. Her husband's name was listed there. That's how they took away her insurance. And she would never turn against her husband. The woman leaned over the papers. Didn't he feel even a little sorry for her? Though, financially speaking, the offer was quite generous. Well, if the offer was reasonable, the man said, then she should agree sooner rather than later. The woman threw the papers straight at him and said there wasn't a drop of mercy in them. The only one who could show her mercy was His Majesty. She asked whether his authority ranked above the king's. Walking past him, she called for Isaac, her servant, to start packing. As head of the family, she demanded a private audience with the king. At sunrise, she would set out on the road. The conversation was over. That evening, she was in her study, thinking about everything that had happened. What infuriated her most was that this man even allowed himself to think it was all so simple. And she couldn't even say anything back to him. Suddenly, the woman heard someone approaching. Definitely not heavy male footsteps, so there was nothing to worry about. Still, she was angry that someone dared disturb her like this, and she was just about to shout when she saw that the one who had burst in was little Sherry. She suddenly jumped up and rushed to the girl, asking if she'd hurt her by accident. She apologized for snapping and making a mistake. Of course, the girl was shaken overall, so the woman soothed her for a long time. Eventually, Sherry fell asleep in her arms. The woman looked down at the girl. Yes, next to her mother, the child felt safe enough to relax and fall asleep. The woman pulled her daughter close and promised that no one would ever take the duchy from her. Soon, the woman herself fell asleep. Sherry was light enough not to disturb her. She woke up first, slowly opening her eyes, trying to figure out where she was. She saw her mom. It was nice to wake up and see her mother right away. She was beautiful, and she could draw a picture of how they'd slept, wrapped in each other's arms. The image appeared clearly in her mind, so the girl immediately ran off to try drawing. But soon, someone else entered the chambers. It was Hilas. He came to the woman with a plate of food. He looked at the woman. She was still asleep, and even mumbling something under her breath. Her face was flushed, like she had a fever. She was sweating and groaning softly. When she woke up, the man told her she hadn't eaten anything at all that day. He slid a bowl, porridge or maybe soup, closer to her and told her to eat, or she'd be completely drained, which was bad. The woman pushed the plate away and said she couldn't be bribed with food, and she didn't want it anyway. But the man wasn't about to give up. He placed his hand on her cheek. He stepped closer and said she probably had a fever, asked if it hurt, if her neck was sore. But she didn't like that kind of attention. She shoved his hand away, saying he was out of line. The man replied that he remembered how she stopped eating when she felt unwell, and that it was a bad habit for a lady who was supposed to be strong. The woman asked what he was even talking about. Had he come for revenge? Hilas stirred the food and said revenge wasn't that simple. Not when your opponent is weak, sick, and can't do anything. So he shoved a spoon into her mouth. And a hungry lady, the soldier said, was not a worthy opponent. That only made her angrier. She was sharp and hot-tempered by nature, so she suddenly knocked the spoon from his hand and sprang up from the chair. And he wasn't planning to coddle her. He suddenly grabbed her by the throat, stopping the furious lady. Holding her by the throat, he shoved her back into the chair. Now he looked far more threatening than before. He said she couldn't even make him take his hands off her. He'd thought that a woman who had stormed the royal palace with such fury would have plenty of strength. And food was strength. He didn't release her throat when he said she'd knocked the spoon from his hand, and he hadn't picked up another. He let go and lifted her chin, saying there were other ways to feed her that soup, just not anything she could easily explain to herself. Not passing food through a kiss, no, something worse, judging by his expression. She remembered how, long ago, when they were young, they had kissed. Fiercely. He wouldn't do that again. No, she'd made sure of that. And so her guess proved right. No kisses. He simply started pouring the soup down her throat. Hilas held the back of her head and kept pouring, not stopping, teaching her that stubbornness wasn't the best way to fight. When he finally let go, she couldn't swallow. She choked and started coughing. Everything spilled over her. She was covered in soup now. Gilas said that look actually suited her. He didn't even notice someone quietly sneaking up behind him. Someone else fighting for their mother. Sherry fought bravely. Just like her mother, stubborn but weak. Both girls were desperately fierce, and he wasn't about to pour soup down a woman's throat in front of a child. So he left, saying that now the woman could eat her soup on her own. That was, he added, if she didn't want to arrive at the palace weak as a walking corpse. The woman picked up the child and shot him a furious look as he left. And, annoyingly enough, he was right. Physically, she was no match for him. She remembered those days that had passed so quickly, when the two of them, still young, had been caught in the rain. Back then, their hands had brushed by accident. He pulled his away immediately, terribly embarrassed. The girl looked up at him and saw something sweet. He turned his head away because he was so shy. Seeing a man blush like that was rare. He had offered to have her wait there while he went to call someone. She didn't let him go anywhere. She grabbed his hand and asked if he was really going to leave her alone in the forest. He said he just didn't want her to freeze and get sick. But the girl thought differently, that with him, she'd be warmer. Back then, she reached out and brushed the hair away from his face. She said that just looking into each other's eyes and talking about anything would be enough. That way, it would feel warmer. He grew even more embarrassed and said it would be better if he left. But the girl didn't let him. She said no. She ordered him to stay. He blushed deeply and was amazed by the things she said and did back then. The girl stepped up in front of him, placed her hand on his cheek, and said he must never forget that he belonged to her. After all, she had no one else but him. The boy replied that he understood and gently wrapped his arms around her. Even then, she could feel how carefully and of his own free will He carried out everything she told him to do, and she loved that about him. That was when she kissed him. And now, at last, the day came when they were to depart for His Majesty. Strangely enough, the heroine's carriage was broken. Repairs would take a long time and be difficult, and she needed to meet the king as soon as possible. It was important. Then the colonel offered to take her in his carriage. There was space, and they were in a hurry. The woman merely glanced in his direction, saying nothing. Her pride clearly wouldn't allow her to agree so easily. She asked a servant how long it would take to fix the carriage. He thought for a moment and answered that it would take about 3 hours. The woman announced that, in that case, circumstances forced them to depart in 3 hours. The man let out a heavy sigh. An unbelievably proud woman. But one could always tame someone like that. That was why she hadn't taken more than a few steps toward the residence when someone grabbed her wrist and pulled her back. To keep her from resisting, the man swept her up into his arms and started carrying her toward his carriage himself. At first, she didn't understand what was happening. Then she cried out, demanding to know what this was supposed to mean. The man said she must be mistaken. They weren't going on a leisurely outing. They were going to the palace. There was a difference. She didn't like it at all. Most of all, she hated that everyone was watching them. She immediately shouted for him to let her go. Then she slapped him hard, yelling even louder. She screamed that he had no right to touch her, that it was unacceptable. His men were stunned by such hysterical behavior. She yelled that she would make him pay, that she would punish him. But he knew how to restrain himself. Not completely, though. Since she was already pushing her limits, he simply threw her into the carriage. The colonel said she probably didn't realize what kind of situation she was in. Evelyn frowned. Could he really be the same boy she once knew? The man said that now she was in a position where she should be the one begging for mercy. Well, things didn't go the way she wanted. And of course they didn't leave in 3 hours. They left when the hero of the war ordered it. They sat in silence for a while. The woman would have preferred it to stay that way. But he spoke, saying he was glad she seemed better. He said that yesterday's dinner must have been worth it if she was feeling better today. Evelyn calmly replied that he was mistaken, because she felt like she was about to throw up at any moment. He only lifted that heavy gaze of his toward her. Hila said that the main thing was for her not to do it right here. A carriage was harder to clean than one might think. At first, she didn't respond. She only grimaced. Clearly, she was furious. Suddenly, she shouted that this was ridiculous. A dog whose bone had been taken away decided to take revenge. It was all nonsense. Before, he couldn't even look her in the eyes. He suddenly leaned closer and said it was obvious. Once, he said, it really had been that way. He was afraid to lift his gaze, respected her, felt something for her. But now, thankfully, it was no longer like that. The woman frowned. Surprisingly, he didn't react to her provocations at all. He was nothing like that handsome young boy. Not at all like the wounded dog who had once fallen at her feet, swearing he would do anything just to stay with her. Back then, he didn't understand why she was so angry, why the punishment could be so cruel, that she would not love him. He begged for forgiveness, humiliated himself, ignored everything else just so she would explain, forgive him. He was ready to do anything, and not just talk about it. He would have done it, if only he wouldn't be thrown away, abandoned. She replied back then that he was talking complete nonsense. That was when it happened, the first blow straight to his cheek, his head. She ordered him to get out. Red liquid splattered. She didn't hold back at all. She hit him for real until he bled. Then she struck him so hard that blood flowed from his right temple. A wound like that would probably leave a scar for life. She had only wanted to see if he was there, to simply look at him while he slept. No extra thoughts. But he woke up and caught her hand. He seemed to get angry, gripping her wrist, standing up and looming over her, asking what exactly she had just been trying to do. The woman was genuinely surprised that he reacted so strongly, and he demanded an answer. She quickly pulled herself together, yanked her hand free, and said she had just been fixing a strand of hair. They were, after all, heading to the palace. And as for him, he was allowing himself far too much, grabbing her wrist like that. She was a lady. She said that his master clearly wasn't doing a very good job training his dog, if it lashed out like that. But the man believed it wasn't for her to judge, since she had nothing to do with it. A little later, the carriage came to a stop. A man entered and said they had arrived, and that he would escort Lady Winter to the king. When the servant left, the hero of the war pulled his hat on and said it wasn't the time to talk about those wonderful days that were long gone. He offered her his hand and said that such foolish things could be put off. The woman looked at him with mild surprise. She wasn't planning to put anything off at all. All of that needed to be forgotten. So she didn't take his hand, walked straight ahead, and said that wasn't the case. She said the times he had just mentioned were filled with filth and worthless things that weren't worth talking about. She called it all boredom. Gilas followed her retreating figure with his gaze. Someone else was already watching him. He told himself that she had just shown her true face. They hadn't seen each other for so long. 7 years since her husband's death. They'd only met at the funeral. Time really did fly. But neither the long years nor the title of widow had spoiled her unique beauty. The man lifted a hand to his face and called her the Ice Rose of Altaric. He assumed that now, finally, this lady would belong to him. And the man who claimed her hand was named Victor Altaric, second in line to the throne. It had been a long time since she'd been here. The palace was familiar to her. She'd visited it more than once before. Victor greeted her. He immediately said that many years had passed since they last saw each other. He said he had almost forgotten the wonderful face of Lady Winter. The woman replied that yes, that was true. So they had met again. She bowed and asked how Victor had been, how his health was, how things were going. It had been a long time since her last visit, and she apologized for that. Victor asked her not to be so cold. He placed a hand on her shoulder and asked if the journey had gone well. He even offered her tea, but the woman declined. She said she was grateful for the offer overall, but she had come with a specific purpose, to meet with His Majesty. She explained that there was a misunderstanding they needed to resolve. Victor pretended to be interested and asked what she meant. He said that, in fact, His Majesty's illness was progressing and that he wasn't quite himself right now. He asked her to have mercy on a man who had been fighting for his life for so long. Instead, Victor could resolve that misunderstanding together with her. He was worried about her, especially since she had come alone for the first time in so many years. Using all of her feminine charm, she replied that she thanked him for his concern, but he needn't worry. No one would disgrace the Winter family. Victor smiled faintly at the corner of his lips and said he very much hoped so. After all, the man escorting her must have been quite rough. Such was his temperament and character. What could be done? Victor mentioned that he had even heard Gilas was willing to strike a deal with the rebels. He asked whether they had gotten to know each other better on the road, since that man was a worthy person. Victor leaned closer to the knight, praising him. It turned out Gilas had saved him from death. It hadn't been easy to break him of a hired killer's habits and turn him into a fine warrior. Victor added that when it came to killing enemies, he knew no mercy. But old habits, he said, patting the warrior on the shoulder, didn't disappear. That was why he'd feared the hero might be a bit rough. Evelyn replied that there hadn't been even a hint of roughness. She would never have thought the man was a mercenary. She said he was quite the gentleman, and that the journey in his company had been wonderful. She said she had felt safe. With men like that, there was no need to worry about the kingdom at all. Victor smiled with satisfaction, completely missing the sarcasm in her words. She raised a hand to her eye and said with a sly smile that one more second and she might truly burst into tears. A servant arrived and said that His Majesty was already waiting for Duchess Winter. She was about to leave. She didn't want to remain in Victor's company, or that of his hero, any longer. But the man called out to her. He suddenly stepped closer, placed his hands romantically on her shoulders, and with concern in his voice, asked her not to overexert herself or get too stressed, since her health should be protected. He placed a hand on her cheek and said that he was the one she could rely on if anything happened. There was no need to remember the distant past, away with bad memories. Victor asked her to simply allow herself to erase those memories and the past, like a bad dream. She pushed his hand away from her face, turned serious, and asked whether he was hinting at those memories from the past. in which he had destroyed her husband. Victor changed instantly, visibly tensing up. Of course, this lady was just like that. But at the entrance to the chambers, the heroine gave him a sly smile and looked at Victor with a fox-like gaze. She said there was no need to be so tense. It had only been a joke. That was how she left them alone, to savor what she had said at the very end. The king truly was gravely ill. He sat on the bed, hidden from prying eyes. He was the first to greet Lady Winter. The woman also greeted His Majesty. She respected the man before her with her entire being. The man extended his hand to her. Even it looked sickly. The woman looked at it and, as the king instructed, stepped closer. She did not recoil. She took the hand, almost entirely covered in wounds and darkened marks, into her own delicate one, and she kissed his hand as well.
Make sure to like and subscribe to the channel for more videos. Meow. Wow.
The woman placed her other hand over her heart and apologized for not having visited for so long, for not asking about his condition in person all this time. Victor became so furious that he even knocked over a small table. He remembered what she used to be like, but he had thought the years would change a person. Turns out, no. It infuriated him that there existed an aristocratic woman who could be so unbearably arrogant. And besides that, some part of him still believed in the impossible, in something that, logically, should not have existed at all. He was angry because he allowed himself to believe that that man had not died back then. It was hard to say or even imagine how that could have happened, but no, Victor truly believed that Rowan Winter was still alive, walking this world just like the rest of them. The king told the woman that this was the first time they had spoken since her husband's funeral. He added that Rowan had been a wonderful man. He had even believed that Rowan could lead their kingdom to glory. But sadly, that never came to pass. Victor, in the king's opinion, had always been too greedy, always wanting to take everything for himself, to grab whatever he could. The king assumed that something in Victor must have changed the moment he gave up the title of best graduate to Rowan. That, perhaps, was the point of no return. The king said he had heard about what happened. He suspected that Victor had done everything he could to frighten her, and then simply claim her for himself. The king asked her not to go against him. The truth was, she likely wouldn't be able to do it alone. The woman replied that even Rowan's death did not mean the Winter family would die with him. From her tone, the king understood that she had come with a very specific plan, and he asked what exactly she meant by that. Meanwhile, Victor was pressuring the hero of the war, ordering him to find Rowan's body, or, if not the body, then Rowan himself. He would not calm down until his own eyes saw the truth. Victor even offered to show the colonel a portrait so he would know his enemy by sight and capture him faster. But as it turned out, the colonel had already seen Rowan before, so he knew the face of the man he was ordered to find. He shocked Victor by saying that he had already seen that man. The second heir rushed up to him and began demanding to know where exactly he had seen Rowan. Victor had the strange feeling that the more he learned about this man, Gilas, the less he actually understood him. Gilas merely said that he had seen Rowan's portrait so many times that his eyes still hurt from that face. He recalled his younger years, back when he had been unfortunate enough to be the one who painted a portrait of the woman he loved with another man. As for what was happening in the king's chambers, the woman stated that as long as she lived, all the wealth and everything they owned was legally bound to her. At the same time she asked for permission regarding something else, Gillis declared that he would definitely find Rowan, and the heroine asked for a chance to prove that she was the one who could save her family. After some time, the woman emerged from the king's chambers with a slightly troubled expression on her face. Victor noticed it immediately and asked what had happened to make her look that way. Victor either hoped or simply assumed that the audience had gone badly. Or perhaps it had gone well, just not well enough. A nearby servant said that His Majesty had ordered Lady Winter to return to her residence for now. Victor said it was outrageous to send a lady home without a carriage. Yes, their ruler could be cruel at times. He offered her his arm and said he could escort her and lend her his carriage for the time being. Oh, this man played a major role in this grim story. He was the illegitimate son of the king and his concubine. Being both an archduke and the second heir to the throne, he had enough power and influence to achieve almost any goal. But in a country where lineage was everything, it wasn't easy for a bastard child to gain the nobles' support. That was precisely why he wanted Lady Winter. She was a duchess. He needed to secure his position. The woman politely declined. She said that if she were accompanied by such a large group of people, others might think they were heading to a festival. He even offered to dance with her. She refused again. Victor nevertheless took her hand and said this was the last time he would ask. Now he looked like a man who posed a threat. But their private exchange was interrupted by a male voice shouting at Victor for cornering a lady. It was the prince, the first heir to the throne, Joshua Alteric. He was clearly displeased with how his uncle was behaving. Victor looked surprised and asked his nephew what had brought him here, since he was supposed to be at the academy. Joshua snapped back, saying it wasn't Victor's place to worry about his student life. Blushing slightly, he greeted Lady Winter and said it had been a long time since they last saw each other. The woman bowed to him with respect and said she was glad to see His Highness, and that she was flattered he remembered her. Joshua replied that she was hard to forget. He added that he had heard she was facing some difficulties and asked how she was feeling. Victor was about to answer for her, saying Joshua was still too young to worry about such things. The woman supported this, saying the prince was indeed very young. She had heard he would soon graduate from the academy, with the best results in his class. Lady Winter stepped closer, took his hands, and said that the kingdom would stand strong on men like him. She said she was proud of him. The prince was surprised and turned red. He replied that he simply wanted to become as great a man as Duke Winter had been. The woman thanked him and said he would have been glad to hear that. Bowing, she politely asked if she might request something from him. Of course, he was ready to do anything. The woman said she was embarrassed to admit it, but she had no carriage to return home. Before arriving at the castle, she explained, they had been attacked by wild wolves. Because of that, the road could be dangerous. So she asked whether she might use Joshua's carriage to get home safely. Victor smiled wickedly. Clever Lady Winter. She's playing mind games with the prince. He was honestly surprised that she would ask something like this. He thought she'd request something serious, but a carriage? That he could easily provide. The lady replied that she would consider it an honor, and she thanked him, kneeling and kissing his hand. She added, even though Joshua was already stunned, that his kindness would never be forgotten. Evelyn also promised that as long as the Winter family lived, no one would ever threaten the prince's life. She swore her loyalty right there, in front of everyone, to Prince Joshua himself. One of the knights thought she was an extraordinary woman. The Archduke's plan wasn't easy to break, yet she poured what felt like a bucket of dirty water over it. I'm curious to see what happens next, he thought. Hilas, who had been observing everything, suddenly smiled as well. Somehow, in a peculiar way, almost mocking. He noticed it, and it only made him more curious about what it meant. The prince commanded the servants to escort Lady Winter to the carriage and make sure everything was done properly. Victor leaned toward her and quietly asked if she planned to keep holding the young prince's hand and cozy up to the old man. The woman walked past him and added only, "Better than licking a rope that's about to snap." Victor said that no matter how amusing all this was, she would regret everything she had said and done. As she approached the carriage, someone else spoke to her. Hila said that the road back crossed contested territory, which was dangerous, so he would accompany her. Lady Winter walked by and asked if perhaps she had made it clear that the pack of wolves was an allegory for him and his men, and that she didn't need an escort. When she reached the carriage, she saw the step was extremely high, and to be sure she wouldn't fall, Hila sat on the ground and offered her a step using his hands. She looked at him with a hint of anger. What was he up to now? Did he really intend to help her just like that? He replied that he had no ulterior motive. He was simply offering assistance to a lady. Well, she had no other choice if she wanted to get home today, so she stepped onto his hands. Almost immediately, her heel cracked, lifted, and broke. She nearly fell, but steadied herself on the ground. Gila said he sincerely appreciated her effort and added that he hoped she would rest well once she reached her residence. This only irritated her further. His pretense of concern annoyed her. He lowered his head and said he wasn't sure how it would sound. But he truly was glad that the lady felt better, that she no longer seemed sick like when he had found her before. He said it was important to him. The woman kicked off the broken shoe and said he needn't show himself to her again. When the carriage departed, one of the warriors close to Gila's remarked that he seemed happy. He replied that even if he was, it didn't matter. He said that things must continue as they were. Mentally, he asked if the lady remembered what she had taught him, that the hunt becomes far more thrilling when the prey stops running and charges the hunter, baring its fangs. He was glad she was better, still loved her husband and daughter, and glad that she still had honor worth defending. Luckily, not all was lost. He was grateful to Lady Winter, grateful for showing him, through her love, what people are sometimes capable of. Grateful that she showed him it wasn't just an incredible feeling, but something that could bring unimaginable pain. He owed her that he could now part with things so easily. Honestly, he was deeply thankful to her, because she had allowed him to become the man he was. Only her. She had raised an enemy herself, one capable of revenge and destruction. A week passed, and the woman and Isaac went off to handle business. They were at the construction site of the Brighton Railway. Apparently, the woman wanted to resume its construction. She was reviewing documents and plans for building the railway. The Brighton project aimed to create a direct route to Brinton, where particularly lucrative mines were located. The plan was meant to stabilize the market, independent of port operations. Rowan Winter had designed it. But it was unclear whether this was a hostile plot or a construction error, because on the railway's opening day, the train exploded along the route. Isaac tried to explain that the risks were too high. Neighboring states might object, and if there were errors in the plans, the woman replied that he was too noisy. The plans were excellent. There was nothing to complain about. The king had told her, while she was in his chambers, that Victor had promised to protect Joshua, and that she should support the heir against the nobility. But for that, something substantial was required. The woman said she understood that they were actively discussing the creation of special institutions, previously neglected, which would help secure His Royal Majesty's position. She also promised to continue the railway project that Rowan had started. Now the woman believed that the fate of the duchy depended on this railway, and they had to make it succeed. Someone else appeared there. He said she was right, but civilians weren't allowed here. It was Gilas. He came demanding to see a permit to be on the site. The woman replied that she had nothing else to do. She wasn't the one meddling in other people's affairs. The man commented that he had never seen such a neglected project, then insisted she leave the area. The woman answered that Gilas's master couldn't handle this, because it was a national project personally backed by the king. So she wasn't the one to leave. She handed the plans to Isaac and ordered him to send them off and bring them back later. Everything here was complete chaos. Gilas ordered the lieutenants to stay in their positions. He himself stepped closer to Lady Winter and said it was dangerous for her to be here alone. He offered that she handle her business peacefully. The woman ignored him. She immediately thought that he had definitely been following her. How else could he have known she was here? He was tailing her to find a way to block her, all for that blasted Victor. Now, after their last encounter, the hostility had reignited and their relationship was ruined, irreversibly. They would try to destroy her family by every possible means. But that was all nonsense. They were truly foolish. She knew her goal, knew what she stood for, so she had to focus on her own path. Now she had to deal with everything Rowan left behind after his death. She missed the man who had been a hero in everyone's eyes, who would have surely known the right decision and taken it. Leaning against the railway, she closed her eyes and reflected. About her husband. About how he once said they were living through terrible times, but he had found a solution that would give them great power. He had decided to create a free market, independent of port operations. She reminded herself not to forget why and for what he had worked so hard. She decided to motivate herself with the thought that this railway was the light that would dispel the darkness of those hard times. She felt her husband near her, his strength, his greatness. She just didn't hear that terrifying sound above her. She froze like a statue in front of the railway, not noticing that something had broken off above, a heavy piece of iron falling toward her. She likely snapped out of her trance only when she felt the physical presence of something above her. Of course, Gilas, noticing something was wrong, managed to intercept her. They even stepped back from the spot where the ice had cracked. She did get her feet wet in the icy water. The man still held her, asking if she was okay. He hadn't immediately noticed her feet were completely soaked, so he said that if left like this, she'd catch a cold. The woman didn't like that he touched her. She reverted to her usual blonde lady state from the king's time and shoved his hand away with a scream. He was left speechless. Mind you, he had just saved her. That's the thanks he got, a full-blown hysteric fit. He calmly explained that if she kept acting like this, the doctors would eventually have to amputate her toes when they froze completely. She spat back a sharp remark, saying he deserved to have his tongue cut out. The man took a small step back. On top of that, a blizzard began. Snow, wild wind, bitter cold. He couldn't just leave her like that. He grabbed her hand, pulled her toward himself, and said he wouldn't let her freeze to death here. He decided not to listen if she protested, simply dragging her along. She didn't have a chance to say anything at first. She thought him an insolent man, daring to just grab a lady. The man said they'd have to wait out the blizzard before heading anywhere. And so he dragged her along, searching for a place where they could hide and maybe warm up. Nearby, fortunately, stood a small cabin, old, wooden, but still it could serve as shelter. The woman, seeing it, was surprised. It was already a familiar place to her. Long ago, that little cabin had been a place of refuge for them. Back then, however, they had ended up there as lovers, not as enemies. Now the place was in terrible condition inside as well. The man finally let her go, knowing she probably wouldn't run away. He suggested Lady Winter simply sit down there and rest, waiting out the bad weather, to avoid further trouble. She sat on a chair. Why resist? She couldn't have gotten there on her own anyway. Once inside, the man decided she needed to warm up. The cabin shielded them from the wind, but a heat source was necessary. He looked around carefully, searching for something that could provide warmth. Usually, that meant fire. Hila suddenly remarked that the place had changed completely. Evelyn replied that she had completely forgotten about the filthy old shack. He could hardly believe it. Could she really not remember anything? After a few minutes, he quietly made a fire. He said that if she wanted to warm up and dry her clothes, she had to come closer. The woman muttered under her breath that the whole situation felt eerily familiar. The man heard her and asked again if she had forgotten that he was now a real soldier. Evelyn smiled, repeating the words slyly, calling him a boy who had been given a knife to play with. The man was quiet for a few minutes, then got up and silently walked toward her. Then, approaching her, he took a lock of her hair in his hand and brought it close to his nose. He said, that's what he was thankful for. She, of course, quickly shoved his hand away. She said she'd had enough of these nonsense games. Besides, she could get home on her own, without any man's help. Hilas guessed she must be joking. If she left this place without informing anyone, she would probably, almost certainly, freeze to death. The heroine replied that at least Archduke Victor would be happy about that. So, does it matter to Gilas? He guessed that his master would simply say it was all very boring, just a foolish death. He looked up, then hurriedly got to his feet. He said that this cabin, from one end to the other, stirred memories for him. There was no hiding from them, not now that he was here. She didn't answer at first, only shot him a meaningful glance. Of course, she understood what he meant. That's why he said he was certain she couldn't escape these memories either. The woman pretended not to understand, even asking what exactly he was implying. And then, suddenly, the man asked if she was truly in love with Rowan Winter. It was so unexpected. A strange question, especially coming from him. He didn't stop with the questions, asking if she, a delicate woman, could still carry this mission through to the end. He also asked if Rowan himself truly loved Lady Evelyn, and if a man who deeply loved his wife would put her in danger. Evelyn suddenly screamed, saying he needed to stop right now. She didn't throw a tantrum, just asked seriously why he was speaking about her husband as if he were still alive. And anyway, if he wanted to ask questions, he should first ask himself if he was really as loyal to the Archduke as he thought. They called him a war hero, thrown so far away. Was he convincing himself he was protecting his majesty? She admitted she noticed he didn't fully trust his own strength either. Gilas cut her off sharply. He said it wasn't her business. Though, if we're honest, her relationship with Rowan wasn't really his business either. But she didn't tell him that. She continued her barrage of questions, asking if Gilas thought the Archduke couldn't betray him. How naive could someone be? A dog that never bites its master? Surely that was Gilas's nature. The man placed his hand over hers and asked if her nature was that of a noble lady, in Evelyn's opinion. The woman laughed, pushing him away. She said his master had indeed taught him to talk if he was spouting such nonsense. But she had an answer to one question. Yes, she loved Rowan. Suddenly, she grabbed his tie, pulling him close. She said that God himself had blessed them. That's why he had no right to doubt that their relationship had been real. After that, silence fell between them, though not for long. While they were here, there was plenty to discuss. The man pulled away from her, exhaled heavily, and turned around. His gaze fell on the bed, which brought back the most memories for both of them, since that was where they had experienced their most intense emotions. He recalled that day again, when they had come together there, when passion and love had ignited between them. He said he knew the next question might seem like a bold breach of all norms, but asked if she had worn a white dress on her wedding day. She was already standing when he asked if she had sworn chastity before the priest that day. Or perhaps she had sworn honesty before the witnesses. The woman hissed that he better shut his mouth right now. He called her a liar if she had really sworn that, because he knew the truth about her. When she was beside him, she slapped him across the cheek with all her strength. She looked at him from under her brow and asked if he hadn't heard her the first time. She had already asked him to be quiet once, but he didn't stop. He touched his fingers to his lips and said that her husband definitely wouldn't make it to heaven now. For that, of course, he got another slap, stronger than the first. She told Gilas that he was just stuck in his dirty past, which was why he behaved so disgracefully, even vulgar, if she was honest, in her opinion. The man touched his bleeding lip, took a bit of blood on his finger, and smeared it across the woman's lips. He said that even now, he wasn't behaving vulgar. The woman frowned again, signaling another hysterical outburst was coming. Not a second passed before she pushed him to the floor, toppled him, and straddled him. The man immediately said he wanted to see Rowan's face if he could witness what his beloved wife was doing right now. But she wasn't going to do anything vulgar. She grabbed his neck and began to strangle him furiously. She said that if he was so curious to see it, he could do so in the afterlife. But Gilas thought differently. He apologized to her and said that no matter how upset it made her, it wasn't the right time. He aimed his pistol at the woman and asked if there was a place, even in the afterlife, for a commoner next to a noble. She didn't know what to say. She hadn't expected him to point a weapon at her. The man recalled painting that portrait. After finishing it, all he could do was run. But then the heroine suddenly burst in, complaining that this was all unacceptable. She came to him in the rain to say that he had no right even to think about running away. He had no right to leave her. Of course, she was a bit stronger than before, so she grabbed Gilas by the collar and pulled him toward her sharply. She hurriedly pulled off his coat and told the tearful Gilas that he simply couldn't leave her, that he had no right to act that way. Then she kissed her lover passionately. The kiss wasn't gentle, it was firm, fully confirming her words. But was it easy for her, taking away his freedom by taking control of her own life? He could only taste a little of that freedom, that luxury, which wasn't available to everyone. If that was what she wanted, he decided to move forward and survive. Right then, in blood and tears, he vowed he would make her pay, and he would put all his effort into it. That's how he ended up on the battlefield. Somewhere there, he saved the Archduke's life, and their first meeting was born. Victor said he was seeing this warrior on the battlefield for the first time, even though he knew many. He asked the man to give his name. The name was also a trigger for him, tied to the woman who had treated him so cruelly. She once said it was boring to have neither a first nor a last name, so she decided to give him one herself. Now he called himself Gilas Black, and he was determined to survive, no matter what it took. He swore to himself he would see it through to the end. The world had betrayed him many times. This was the name of a man abandoned by all. He dreamed, obsessed over revenge against the woman who had once killed him. And now he waited for the moment when the woman would stand before the barrel of his gun. Both lieutenants present suddenly heard a loud sound, like gunshots. They saw smoke in the forest. The younger lieutenant asked if he should report it, but the senior told him to wait. He knew it wasn't the time to make a scene, and asked the young man to go and better prepare the carriage. Meanwhile, the Winter household governess picked up the phone. She told the Duchess wasn't home, but a male voice said he was pleased to meet Miss Wilson and asked if everyone in their house was so stern and harsh. She, of course, didn't understand who was calling or why his voice sounded mocking. On the other end was none other than Archduke Victor. He had set up a mini revenge for the Duchess over what had happened at the castle. He said his gift should have already arrived, so they should accept it gladly. And sure enough, at that very moment, Isaac entered the castle. Now completely beaten, bloody, barely able to walk. He told everyone that masked men had attacked him, beaten him, and taken all the documents entrusted to him by the Duchess. He was embarrassed to admit it, and, unfortunately, Lady Winter was left completely alone out there in the forest. At that very moment, messengers from the Archduke also entered the estate, completely ignoring the man. The woman looked at them in surprise. What message? Why did everything happen at exactly the same time? At the same time, the man fired from his barrel, which turned out not to be a real weapon at all. He pushed her off him and said he hadn't expected to surprise her so much with a single shot, and not even from a real gun. That's when the lieutenant arrived. Gilas was already on his feet. He was informed that the carriage was ready. The man said it was time to go. Gilas personally intended to escort Lady Winter to the estate. She didn't stop being herself. She said it would be really stupid to waste that one chance for revenge. He no longer interested her. He looked at her arrogantly. He said Evelyn probably hadn't heard the gossip or official news yet. At that time, Victor said a nice gift awaited Lady Winter. He knew how much she lacked social contact, and she was probably very lonely. She must have lost something very important. The man explained that years ago, the woman had decided to sell some of her lands, which he bought along with the estate. And those few people came to inform them that a ball would be held at a nearby estate in 2 weeks. And this ball was to be held at Gilas Black's estate. The same news the Duchess had just heard personally from the host of the event. She was surprised that the Archduke would just gift him the lands so casually. The man said that Mr. Rowan, Duke Winter, probably wouldn't be happy to hear that the war hero had settled nearby. But as the new neighbor of Lady Winter, he personally invited the heroine to the ball in 2 weeks. And the young man at the Winter estate said the Archduke personally stated that this wasn't an invitation. Then Victor hung up and went to the window, satisfied. This time, the woman accepted his help and got up from the floor. She had already organized her thoughts and figured out what to say. As it turned out, from that moment, she had been eagerly awaiting this ball. When the carriage arrived at the Winter estate, the servants immediately ran to meet their lady. They had already started informing her about a letter from the Archduke, while the heroine walked arm in arm with Gilas. She was barely walking. When he looked at the two of them with his cold gaze, both women stopped and went silent. The woman turned to the colonel and told him she had a lot of work today and no time to receive guests. She could get there herself from here. He didn't argue, just said they'd see each other soon anyway. She didn't accompany him. She didn't want to see him anymore and slowly walked toward the estate. The servants worried about their Lady Winter, so they immediately ran up to her, asking if she was all right. She replied that it wasn't as bad as it might have seemed, but she was a little worried about something else. She found the one she had been worried about, beaten Isaac, apologizing and barely standing on his feet. She wasn't even surprised that it had happened this way. It was probably the plan from the start. The Archduke had thought carefully about how to ruin her day. She calmly ordered the women to first prepare a bath and, if possible, call a doctor. Suddenly she felt worse than she had thought. A sharp pain in her head confirmed it. Before going into the bath, she ordered that not just any doctor be called, but Oscar. The woman looked exhausted. She sat in the bath, thinking about everything that had happened today. So, a ball in 2 weeks. She remembered how the man had invited her, saying that her presence would make the ball brighter. She wondered if the Archduke had bought the lands near the Winter Duchy just to destroy her. They probably wanted to destroy everything Rowan had built. As for him, he had once said that the time would come when the current king's power would fade. Then, he said, the struggle for power would begin. This would increase pressure on their duchy. There would come times when she would need help. The man regretted that he didn't have as many friends as he would have liked. There weren't many people who would stand up for them. Now she understood that they really were surrounded by enemies on all sides. Everyone wanted to conquer them. Everyone hated them. Even the servants now seemed terribly scared. She wondered if Rowan, her dear husband, felt the same way she did right now. So lonely, so insignificant in a big world. She didn't know that he felt the same. She could only guess that it had been hard for him to understand what was happening around him. He probably had no one to rely on, feeling not just lonely, but as if he were the only person on the planet. And now she felt the same. Her heart felt so heavy, it was indescribable. She felt abandoned by everyone. Suddenly, she felt someone touch her. She jumped up, recoiled, about to scream at the intrusion. It turned out to be little Sherry, who seemed to have been crying a lot and wanted her mommy. The heroine was genuinely surprised that Sherry had somehow managed to get in, since there were probably servants. And she was crying, too. Suddenly, just like her mother, the little girl did something unpredictable. She jumped straight into her mother's bath. The woman was very surprised. She immediately pulled her out, saying that she couldn't do that. She was soaking wet now. But then she paused. She was surprised that her daughter had cried so much. She didn't even want to scold her for such behavior, since she clearly was very distressed. Then the woman just hugged her tightly. Whenever loneliness came to mind, this incredible little girl appeared. Indeed, she still had this little person in her life, and for her sake, she had to keep going. The woman told Sherry she had nothing to worry about, because as long as she was here, Evelyn would never give up. Evelyn said that fear and cowardice were foreign to her. She wouldn't run from it because she had promised him that. When the bath water cooled, the woman decided it was time for both of them to get out so they wouldn't freeze. While dressing the little girl, she heard the governess shouting something, and she also heard a man's voice, objecting and approaching very quickly, scolding them for leaving Lady Winter alone for 2 whole hours, while the governess explained that no matter how close he was, he couldn't be let in. But the man broke through anyway. He yelled that leaving a patient alone for such a long time was strictly forbidden. He burst into the bath with furious shouts, not even thinking that the woman might be without clothes. Totally rude. The heroine managed to dress the girl. Both of them looked at the man, who had so forcefully barged in. He immediately went to Evelyn, saying she looked pale and might even have a fever. He decided to check right away, pressing something to her forehead. But the heroine wouldn't allow anyone to treat her that way. So he got a well-deserved slap for barging in. She called him far too uncivilized. She sarcastically asked Oscar Cole if all doctors were the same, rude and doing whatever they wanted. He said that no one had called him that in a long time, but he was glad the woman was all right. The heroine asked him to drop the formalities. Oscar smiled and said she hadn't changed at all. Later they walked through the estate, talking, because they were true friends. And someone was watching them. She had a stalker who wished them no good. When the woman told Oscar that she planned to restore and continue the bridge project, he was extremely surprised. He remembered that Rowan had indeed been in charge of that case. But to take it up again now, that was something new. The woman asked if he thought she was joking, or if he believed she had lost her mind. Oscar lowered his gaze and said that wasn't what he meant at all. He simply remembered how people had exploded with anger when the project was first announced. They had always been hostile, but back then, they united and marched in protests. He turned to the Duchess and explained that even now, the people were rebelling against the aristocracy, so this project might only provoke them further. Nothing changed on her face. She seemed to listen carefully to his words, and already knew that the people were still dissatisfied. Suddenly, she said something completely unrelated. She seemed confused because Oscar had started addressing her formally. She wasn't used to that from him. While the man tried to explain himself, the woman said it was sad that he had stopped calling her by her name. The woman sincerely admitted that she truly missed how things used to be. Even Oscar remembered how the three of them had once been close. The married couple and Oscar. Those had been good times. The man said it really had been wonderful. He liked remembering those carefree days when they would simply talk and spend time together. While they were talking, someone entered the room without knocking. The door opened with a small hand, and there were no other little children in the estate. Sherry confidently walked into the room. Oscar immediately ran up to the child and lifted her into his arms. He called her the sweetest little creature and could hardly believe how much she had grown. The woman reminded her daughter that she shouldn't forget her manners and should knock before entering. But Oscar replied that there was no need for formalities here, since there were no strangers around. Oscar kept praising the girl, saying he remembered when she couldn't even walk yet, and now look at her, running around everywhere. He also started bombarding her with questions about her age and asked whether she had received all the gifts he had sent her. He even introduced himself, assuming she probably didn't remember who he was. But the girl simply blinked and said nothing. Silently, she shifted her gaze from the man to somewhere on his chest, but didn't answer. She didn't seem shy either. Eventually, he set her down and said she didn't have to answer anything, of course. She probably wanted to go look at the rabbits anyway. As he watched the small figure leave, he suddenly fell into thought, and the smile disappeared from his lips. Oscar said that ever since the tragedy, it seemed the girl was still in shock, even though she had been very little at the time. Back then, a man had held her tightly against himself, threatening to slit her throat right in front of her parents. He warned that he wouldn't leave the child alive if they took even one more step closer. The woman tried to stop Rowan, but Rowan Winter was not the kind of man who would be frightened and back down. That was exactly what made him terrifying. With his dreadful gaze, he could almost pierce someone's head without even firing a bullet. As soon as the woman thought about it, she suddenly felt sick. The cup slipped from her hands and fell. Oscar immediately asked her not to get up and to stay where she was so she wouldn't cut herself. He raised his eyes to look at the woman because he noticed that something clearly wasn't right with her. Evelyn was shaking. She rarely showed when she was scared or in pain, but right now, she simply couldn't stop trembling. Oscar stepped closer and asked when she had last eaten or slept properly, because she didn't look like a healthy woman at all. Besides, she was sweating heavily. It was hard to say immediately whether it was some illness, but he at least suspected that she barely ate or slept and was under a lot of stress. He asked if he should bring her something. Well, call someone to bring it. Maybe some water or tea, or perhaps some food. But at that very moment, for some reason, she remembered him. That terrifying look of his made something in her heart tighten. Then Evelyn took his hand in hers and confessed that she actually had something to tell him. And something to ask. At that same time, the little girl had just stepped outside to take a walk and look for the rabbits. She imagined catching one and bringing it back to her mom and that uncle. They would be surprised, but they would also praise her. The moment the girl spotted one rabbit, a loud sound rang out. Something flew straight into the rabbit. In less than a second, the white snow was stained with a red liquid. She didn't even have time to be scared before a man appeared in front of her. At that very moment, Evelyn barely managed to stand up from her seat and immediately collapsed into Oscar's arms. He begged her to explain why she was in such a state, what had happened. The heroine said that he was the only one she could trust, that everyone else was against her, determined to take the estate and everything in it away from her. Oscar understood nothing at all. Who would even dare to do such a thing? But the woman was in such a condition that it was extremely difficult to get any clear answers from her. Yet Evelyn still saw the general before her eyes, pointing the barrel of his pistol at her. And she barely managed to whisper that the man had returned. At that exact second, another woman burst into the room and cried out Evelyn's daughter's name as if something terrible had happened. The woman seemed to be rushing, almost running. She explained everything while they were already on their way outside. But the moment she anxiously said the little lady's name, It felt as if Evelyn's heart stopped beating in her chest for a second. She rushed outside without even taking her cane, without putting on proper clothes, just as she was. It was impossible to describe how terrified she was of what might have happened. There, not far away, the woman saw something belonging to Sherry lying in the snow, covered in blood. As much as it was possible, Evelyn seemed to turn pale. So pale that she became the same color as the snow. The woman remembered her husband's funeral. She remembered how people said the Winter Duchy was cursed, how even Rowan, the head of the family, couldn't endure it. They said the problem was Evelyn, that from the moment she was born, everyone around her, all her relatives, began dying one after another. They called her all kinds of names, most often a witch. But she seemed so consumed by her grief that all those words simply passed right through her. Just when it seemed like she couldn't endure it anymore, the door opened and little Sherry walked into the room. The woman said she had asked not to let anyone in, but apparently she was such a terrifying witch that no one even bothered to listen to her. When she lifted her gaze to Sherry, she was surprised that the girl didn't run away from her or look afraid. The woman began explaining that the moment she was born, people around her started dying. She had lost her brothers, her sisters, and even her uncle. But it seemed her terrible soul wasn't satisfied even with that. Now, she had taken the life of her own husband, Sherry's father. The woman kept calling herself a monster that drained life from others. She begged the girl to leave, but instead, the child reached out her hand to her. She didn't think her mother was a monster. She didn't understand why her mother believed she was so evil when she loved Sherry so much. Of course, she couldn't say that out loud, but she showed it by not leaving her mother alone in her grief. With her tiny hands, she touched her mother's face, and it felt as if, after a long storm, warm rays of sunlight had finally fallen on her. In those small hands, the woman felt as if they were telling her that monsters don't cry. They don't feel sorrow. So she wasn't a monster. Her little eyes reminded her of the days when she had been in love. This small girl became her spring after a long winter. Someone finally placed a warm cloak over the woman's shoulders, while everyone frantically searched for the little girl. They asked her to stay calm and said that if someone had entered the territory, they probably knew the area well. But they were determined to search everything quickly so that no one could leave unnoticed. It was hard to say if she heard even a single word. Everything seemed to pass right by her ears. In the distance, she thought she saw two familiar figures. He was there. Rowan was there. And he was holding Sherry's hand, about to take her somewhere. Without waiting for them to leave, the heroine rushed after them, throwing herself straight into the water and shocking everyone. The servants begged her to stop, saying she would only hurt herself and wouldn't save anyone that way. The woman stopped feeling anything at all. She could only see. She saw her family ahead of her and felt the desperate need to move forward. But the harder she pushed forward, the farther Rowan seemed to move away. She didn't feel how the icy water was freezing her to the bone, how one wrong step could have killed her. But she simply couldn't allow herself to lose them both again. She wouldn't let Rowan take Sherry. No, the girl was still far too young. Yet none of her thoughts or efforts helped. They didn't stop for even a moment. They kept walking farther and farther away, slowly, but at the same time so quickly. She had already crossed the entire lake, reaching forward with her whole body, even though she could barely walk, shouting at the top of her lungs for Rowan to leave her daughter with her. She begged him to stop, saying she truly had no one else left, that she would die here, that she wouldn't survive it. She asked if he was angry with her, because if he was, she was ready to die. She would offer him her life if only he would let her daughter go. But Rowan disappeared. Instead, another man approached her, a man with such a terrifying aura that it could be felt even from a distance. Before her stood a large, broad-shouldered man with a cold gaze. But she recognized him. The eyes were familiar. She stared at him in shock, especially at the weapon in his hand, which was somehow covered in blood. Evelyn was so stunned that she couldn't believe he had done it. that it wasn't Rowan, but this man who had taken her daughter away. Barely moving her lips, the woman whispered that she simply refused to believe he was capable of such a thing. No, he couldn't be. And she was right, because when the man opened his cloak, there she was, little, frightened Sherry, clinging tightly to his leg. The man explained that, while he was out hunting, he noticed a suspicious man dragging Sherry along with him. He shot the man, but the snowstorm had covered the tracks. Sherry had been terribly frightened, but if she was clinging to this man so tightly, it was unlikely he had done anything to harm her. Evelyn was stunned by what she had heard and seen. The situation struck her old wounds painfully, like salt rubbed into an open cut. When the child realized her mother was there, she rushed into her arms in hysterical sobs. The man silently watched their reunion. The woman didn't even care that she was kneeling in front of him. She was simply grateful that Sherry was alive. By the way, the servants had run after her as well. Worried, they shouted that a snowstorm had started, and since she was completely soaked, she must be freezing. The general lowered his mask and said that because of them, his hunt had been ruined. That annoyed him. After a few seconds holding the child in her arms, Evelyn finally calmed down a little. She no longer felt trapped or terrified. The heroine admitted that she was now in his debt, because without him, she probably wouldn't have found Sherry alive. She ordered the servants to let the colonel into the estate, believing it was only right to repay him for saving the child. The man replied that such an invitation from Lady Winter was a great honor for him. While the servants helped the two ladies to their feet, Oscar was already rushing toward them. He was already scolding Evelyn for jumping into the water when she was clearly not in good condition. People should always act reasonably. As he hurried toward the Duchess, he passed by the colonel. The man was tall, broad, and cold. His very aura pushed people away. When they lightly bumped shoulders, Oscar apologized and continued forward toward Evelyn. But at the last moment, he felt as if he recognized something about the man. It was a strangely familiar face. Then, struck by a sudden memory, he realized exactly where he had seen that man before. It was from that memory when they had all been together. Back then, a young man had been sketching them, and he had known Evelyn. And although he had completely changed, although his gaze had become as cold as ice, it was definitely him. The very same boy now stood before him. Only now he was no longer young or friendly. Oscar was genuinely shocked that he had actually run into him again. Soon after, they were served high-quality black tea. The governess made sure to point that out. She was still worried that her lady had invited that man into the estate. She couldn't help noticing the strange atmosphere hanging in the room, an atmosphere that seemed to appear because of that man. Oscar, by the way, was no less surprised than the governess. Calmly, he picked up his cup of tea, took a sip, and stared at the man sitting across from him. He asked the colonel whether he was mistaken or if he was truly looking at the very same Colonel Black. The man replied that Oscar was not mistaken. It was indeed him, Colonel Black. With a hint that he also knew the man in front of him, he addressed him as Marquis Cole. Oscar was a little surprised, though not enough to stop the conversation. He said it was hard to believe they had already met once before, when they had both been practically children. The colonel calmly replied that he felt the same way. He added that he hoped Oscar had been doing well. Evelyn finally stepped in and said there was no need to speak so formally, as if they were at some official reception. Oscar agreed with her. Evelyn then decided to properly thank him for saving her daughter. She felt she should do it in a more proper state than she had earlier outside. The man replied that it wasn't even worth mentioning. He was glad he had been able to help, but he believed the real issue was finding the person responsible. He even said directly that Lady Winter had quite a few enemies, so it wasn't surprising something like this had happened. Still, perhaps she had some idea who it might be. She said she was grateful that he had noticed and told her about it, then asked if there was anything else he could say about the situation. When she noticed he had fallen silent, Evelyn offered his help with the upcoming ball. It was a big event after all, but he refused. As if remembering something, he turned to Lady Winter and mentioned that she didn't seem to have a suitable partner for the celebration. So the colonel decided to invite Marquis Cole as well, arguing that the lady's fiancé, Rowan, would surely be pleased if she attended. He added that he himself would be glad if their mutual friend, Oscar, were the one to accompany her. She placed her cup on the table and said that what he had just said was rather rude. She added that, although the world had changed greatly, the influence of social status had not disappeared. She asked him to keep such remarks to himself instead of voicing them where they weren't welcome. The colonel apologized. The man replied that on the battlefield there had been no place to learn proper manners, so sometimes he didn't control what he said. He said he had seen countless people fall after being blinded by victory. As he spoke, he looked at them and imagined how much everything had changed since the days when they had all been together. His gaze grew even colder as he said that sometimes he forgot where he was. Then, without another word, the man stood up and walked past them both. Evelyn and Oscar followed him with their eyes. He stopped by the window and said that, if he remembered correctly, Evelyn had asked whether he needed anything else. The tone in his voice made it clear that he did. He asked Lady Winter to provide him with one of the guest rooms. He explained that he probably wouldn't be able to make it home now. The weather had worsened too much, and there was a chance he wouldn't make it there safely. After everyone went to their rooms, Oscar found himself thinking deeply about something. He concluded that the atmosphere today had been far too strange. What could possibly have happened while he had been away? According to his memories, that man had once been nothing more than a servant here. It was hard to believe a person could change that much. Amazing, Oscar thought. Back then, everything had seemed so simple and clear. He remembered a scene from the past, how that boy had once leaned over Evelyn, and suddenly it felt as if he understood something, or remembered something he had overlooked before. That same night, Evelyn tried to reach Oscar because she had caught a cold earlier when she jumped into the water, and now her temperature had risen. She had planned to call for a doctor. At least, that had been her first thought. She intended to call the way she usually did. At first, she reached for the little bell that would alert the servants that she needed them, but then she decided to go find Oscar herself. In her study, however, she saw a light. Thinking it was Oscar, she called out to him. She felt terrible and simply wanted him to respond. As she walked, she took her cane with her, but moving felt harder than ever. The fever had completely drained her strength. She asked why the man wasn't answering her. After all, she had come looking for him because she needed help quickly, yet he was ignoring her. But then she noticed it wasn't Oscar. It was someone else. And tonight, there was only one man in the estate who might enter her study without permission. And he looked rather grim. At that same moment, Oscar realized what had been bothering him so persistently. He was even a little upset that he had allowed himself to forget it all this time. Those days had been strange. He remembered the scene he had once witnessed with his own eyes, when that boy had kissed Evelyn on the forehead. He had truly been shocked by what he saw. It had been completely unexpected. Even back then, Oscar had noticed strange changes in the boy's behavior. Oscar thought that, as far as he knew, people usually didn't look at their master with that kind of gaze. And now, no longer holding any authority over the man, she was stunned to find him standing in her study. She was so shocked that for a second she forgot how terrible she had been feeling just moments before. Her vision even seemed to clear. Leaning on her cane, she whispered in surprise, asking what he was even doing here. But after the initial shock faded, she felt again that she still wasn't feeling well at all. As it turned out, Keyless had been examining a painting. He asked whether she also thought the painting was quite beautiful. Instead, the heroine simply replied that his manners were terrible, considering he was in someone else's estate. She muttered that with that much energy, he could have easily gone home. So it wasn't clear why he had stayed here at all. Evelyn sat down and took a drink of alcohol. She thought about the fact that she couldn't just leave, since he had come into her study for some reason, and no one knew what his intentions were. Meanwhile, everything in her vision began to blur. She decided not to call anyone anymore. Not a doctor, not Oscar. Her head hurt terribly, and she didn't want to see anyone. She didn't even hear or notice when the colonel quietly approached her and touched her hair. He informed her of something she already knew, that she had a fever. It seemed he was actually the one who had prevented her from finding someone who could help. He offered to call a doctor, but the woman replied that there was no need to worry. She felt fine enough. Stubborn, wasn't she? The man asked whether her doctor was really that bad that she didn't even want to call for him. Or perhaps, he added, he had simply interrupted a private meeting between Lady Winter and Oscar. Hearing that, the woman was obviously shocked. She jumped to her feet and might have said something harsh to him, as she usually did. But her head hurt far too much for shouting or even standing, anything that required more effort than simply sitting still. She replied that what he said sounded completely absurd, calling it nonsense. But the man continued, saying that she had apparently been the one looking for him. The man poured some water into a glass and brought it to her, saying he only wanted to help. Surprisingly, the heroine had nothing against accepting the help. She nearly gulped down the water in one go. He noticed that the alcohol on the table was 20 years old. He remarked that it was unexpected for a woman to enjoy something like that. She simply informed him that it was a fine drink and probably cost about as much as a carriage. He replied that it was obvious and expressed a desire to try it. She hadn't invited him to drink, so it could be said that it was rather bold of him. The man lightly clinked his glass against hers and suggested they simply share the drink she had praised so highly. It was hard to say whether he liked it, because after taking a sip, not a single emotion crossed his face. But she hadn't looked at him just to see his reaction. Suddenly, she saw the old Gilas again, the one from before. It felt like a fantasy, a hallucination, a dream, but not reality. And it couldn't possibly be real, so she had to calm herself down. She shook her head, trying at least a little to clear her mind. When the woman reached for the glass again, she didn't notice that the man had earlier placed his own glass there. His drink had been strong, undiluted alcohol. Evelyn grabbed her throat and rasped in pain. Just imagine. She was already feeling terrible, and now she had swallowed strong liquor on top of her cold. Gilas calmly explained that she had apparently taken the glass that belonged to him. But, unsurprisingly, she didn't really care at that moment. The colonel walked over to the table and poured a glass of plain water to bring to the woman. Slowly, without rushing. Soon she felt Gilas gently touch her chin to turn her head toward him. Lifting her head just enough to help her drink the water, he remarked that she had always needed a lot of attention. And she didn't resist at all while he helped her drink. She felt so awful that she simply didn't care anymore. After a few sips, he asked Evelyn how she was feeling. For some reason, she once again saw him as he used to be, the real one, the boy who had remained in her memories. She barely thought about what she was doing anymore. She reached out her hand and gently placed it on his cheek. Evelyn blushed, smiled, and almost purred his name. Of course, he removed her hand. He assumed she probably didn't even realize what she was doing anymore. He wasn't wrong, because her body, unable to handle the strain, suddenly collapsed straight against Gilas's chest. All he managed to do was roll his eyes. Meanwhile, the heroine had already fallen into a deep, peaceful sleep. Apparently, she didn't feel much difference between pillows and his mountains of muscle. He laid the woman down to sleep near the fireplace and even found something to cover her with. Now that he had done that, at least he wouldn't feel guilty about leaving her like that. In fact, he was already about to leave. But he stopped when he heard someone moving somewhere outside the door. Or perhaps fate itself had stopped him. It was unlikely anyone would come inside, but he didn't need unnecessary gossip. The footsteps quickly faded away. But before he could take even a single step, someone suddenly grabbed his shirt and pulled him back. Not a stranger, of course. She was still here, too. And Evelyn, though not fully conscious, asked him to stay. She called his name. And it seemed Gilas himself was surprised by that. So that night, he didn't leave the study. Somewhere in her dreams or memories, the woman became a younger version of herself again. Back then, she had managed to hunt a fox. She lifted the animal by its tail, almost as if she had forgotten that she herself had shot it. Looking at the beautiful color of the fur, the girl thought it wouldn't be a bad idea to bring it to Gilas so he could make her a scarf. She could already see him. The boy was standing not far away when she started calling out to him. Why didn't he come back when she called out to him the first time? Gilas looked completely ordinary standing there, not far away. She decided the boy must have gotten lost in thought, so she happily walked toward him, lifting the fox up. The girl was proudly showing off the predator she had hunted. She shifted her gaze to the animal, wanting to judge how nice a scarf it might make. But in her hands, there was no predator, only the familiar head, completely without a body. Of course, she threw the head away from herself and, startled, even fell to the ground. Where had that come from in her hands? She hadn't expected the world around her to suddenly change and grow dark. And then the head spoke to her. Bloody tears even began to stream from its eyes. The man said that she was the one who had lost them, that it was a mistake to have accepted her. And he wasn't alone there. Several more heads lay in a large pool of blood. They were all talking to her, damned dead men. The girl was so terrified that she couldn't even scream. Who could possibly help her? And then he appeared. Rowan appeared. He took her by the hand and said he was sorry that she had ended up in such a dreadful place. The heroine looked at him with both hope and fear. Where had he come from? Had he come for her? The man reassured the girl, saying he would save her. He even picked her up in his arms to carry her away. But in his arms, over his shoulder, she saw Gilas. He was still there. A ring of light had formed around the boy, and he seemed unreachable. Evelyn reached out to him. She kept reaching, but the figure grew farther away as Rowan carried her further and further. Yet he carried her along a road covered in blood, and Gilas stayed behind. After a while, the boy walked toward the light himself. He didn't even turn around or look back at his mistress. Then the woman woke up, sweat dripping down her face in drops. She hadn't quite figured out where she was yet when she suddenly heard a man's voice asking if she had woken up. It turned out she had been sleeping on his lap. The man explained that it was hard not to notice she had been having a nightmare. He himself, of course, had been sitting there calmly, reading a book. The woman glanced at Gilas from under her brow. For now, she didn't even question why he was here. The only thing that really worried her was the dream. So she asked whether she might have been talking in her sleep. Gilas let out a breath and replied that he hadn't heard anything like that. Now that she was awake, the man decided to put her back to sleep. He pressed a cloth to her forehead and laid her down on the couch. He explained that the rest was what had brought her fever down. He said he would step away for a short while and then return. She didn't argue when he laid her down, but she reminded him that the servants were outside the door. Gilas assured her that he could leave without anyone noticing. He asked her to sleep for a while. She barely processed his words. She looked at him, at Colonel Black, no longer her Gil. Evelyn wondered what was going on in his head. Had he really shown such kindness and decided to stay with a sick woman? Or was he waiting for his enemy to weaken so he could strike? The woman realized she had grown far too hazy. Had she gotten drunk? From just a single sip? Apparently so. Perhaps that was why, lying on her enemy's lap, she felt completely safe and comfortable. As soon as the sun rose, the colonel quickly got ready. The carriage was already prepared. But he intended to leave the residence on foot, even though the road home was not short. The heroine woke up sometime shortly after he had left. This time, the bright rays of sunlight had probably woken her. Her head felt like cotton, but she felt better overall. She remembered that Gilas had been here that night. It was still early morning, yet she didn't find him in her office. Walking slowly, the woman approached the window and looked out. She had a feeling she would see him there. And she wasn't mistaken, because Colonel Black was already almost leaving her courtyard. But she could only see his gaze. She didn't see how he clenched his hand into a fist, how he tightened his jaw at the memory of how she had asked that night whether she had spoken in her sleep. Because she, of course, didn't remember what she had done. After she grabbed him, the man had asked her to move less. Gilas had intended to call someone, perhaps a doctor or a servant. But he hadn't expected it at all and didn't even have time to react when she stood up. Evelyn pressed her body against his. He could even feel her breath on his lips. And for some reason it irritated him greatly now that he had the chance to think it over. Time passed. The day of the ball arrived. Many famous people were there. Some of them had even been mentioned in the newspapers recently. In fact, the Archduke had influenced that. Among them, one could also recognize Count Theodor. There were all kinds of rumors about him. People said he borrowed money from everyone just to pay off his own debts. These days, it's not really about what status you hold. It's about how much money you make. The noise in the hall grew louder when the host appeared. The main figure of the evening, Gilas Black, looked incredibly elegant. He barely spoke to anyone. He didn't really like events like this, but someone eventually pulled him out of his thoughts. The Archduke was already walking toward him. He said he hadn't expected the ball to be this lavish. It almost seemed a bit too much. Black replied that the man was flattering him, but it was actually the truth. The Archduke said that standing around like this wouldn't do. Gilas needed to mingle a bit at his own celebration. He pointed to all the ladies scattered around the estate and said they were all absolutely fascinated by Gilas. And it was true. Whenever he appeared in their line of sight, they gasped, blushed, and eagerly started whispering about him. Meanwhile, Hans approached them to announce the arrival of an important guest. The Archduke hadn't told Black that he had one more gift for him, so he spoke quietly with Hans. Around that time, the heroine had begun choosing her outfit. She had to hurry. It was already time to leave. Evelyn examined the dresses rather skeptically, but it seemed she couldn't choose any of them. She told the woman that she didn't like any of them. The lady insisted that couldn't possibly be true. They were all of the highest quality. Even though the lady wanted to suggest something else, Evelyn insisted that Wilson bring her a dress from her own wardrobe. When the maid hesitated, Evelyn replied that she was asking for exactly the dress she had just thought of. The one that had been hidden behind the wooden doors of her wardrobe for a very long time. Finally, a carriage pulled up to the estate. The Archduke insisted they greet her together. But he hinted that whoever was in that carriage was actually his gift to Gilas. He introduced her as the most eligible noblewoman in the entire kingdom, Lady Perez. When she saw the Archduke and the colonel, she politely greeted them. The girl was a relative of the Archduke. Her name, in fact, was Sonia. That's how Victor addressed her. He said the colonel should give her a proper welcome. Victor said that on the entire continent, there wasn't a girl more beautiful than her. Colonel Black stepped toward her and said it was an honor to see Lady Perez. He welcomed her to his estate. He introduced himself, and it even seemed like he blushed a little. The girl truly was very beautiful, and it seemed she liked him as well. Stammering slightly, she said she had heard a lot about him. He politely replied that perhaps he wasn't worthy of all those kind words about him. He had already extended his hand, offering to personally escort her into the residence. Even though the girl blushed shyly, she was clearly ready to accept. Her face had turned so red. At that very moment, another carriage arrived, and a servant announced that the final guest had arrived. Of course, the charming moment between Sonia and Gilas was interrupted. The servant announced that the head of the Winter family had arrived. As soon as the heroine began stepping out, the Archduke smiled and asked whether she had mistaken the address and was perhaps headed to church instead. Evelyn smiled. Victor had a reason to ask that, because that's exactly how she was dressed, completely in black, as if she had come to a funeral, or like a nun. She replied that she hadn't mistaken the address, since the invitation had been sent to her here. Everyone standing outside immediately began whispering and gossiping. She said she had arrived by invitation of His Excellence. So why such a cold welcome? The Archduke replied that if someone overheard that, they might misunderstand. She glanced at Gilas somewhat mysteriously, as if about to say something. But first, she stepped closer to him. She herself suggested that the host of the evening escort her to the hall. Of course, that was a little unexpected, since he had just been about to escort Sonia. She probably didn't know. Although sometimes she behaved in such a way that even if she did know, she would still do things her own way. The man took Evelyn's hand in his and kissed it. He said he was glad to see Lady Winter here and would gladly escort her. And just like that, they left the royal guests behind. Sonia's eye practically twitched. She had never seen anyone treat her with such disregard. Looking at the woman, she thought that wasn't a noble lady at all, but a real witch who had come from the Winter Duchy. The girl stared after her without looking away. When they entered the estate, the name of the final guest was announced loudly across the entire hall. It wasn't surprising that everyone immediately began discussing her intensely. Her outfit for the celebration was shocking. People shouted that she must be out of her mind, that she was a disgusting witch, and that she shouldn't have come at all. The woman thanked Gilas for escorting her, and, with a smile, added that everyone seemed so jealous of her. So she'd be just fine, in very good company. By the way, she decided to ask the colonel what it felt like to be the center of attention. At first, he simply looked at her, not even managing to answer, before it was announced that the ball was about to begin. Gilas closed his eyes and said it was time for him to go now that he had escorted the heroine to the hall. It's important to know who this Sonia was who had come to the ball. As for her family, the history of that house was rather short. The daughter of Count Perez, who worked as a lady-in-waiting, managed to rise quite high. She gave birth to Victor, and at the same time became the king's favorite. In truth, that should have raised the status of Count Perez's family. But later, the lady died in an accident, and the family's position once again became uncertain. Once, Victor told Sonia that the world was changing, and a good reputation alone wouldn't give them anything. He said they had to strive for something more tangible. He said it could be many things: weapons, an army, blood. There were more paths than it seemed. He said there needed to be a strong barrier that could protect them from any wave. When Sir Gilas met Sonia again at the ball, he politely asked if she was all right. After all, he had left her outside earlier when he was supposed to escort her in. He even offered her a dance, but added that if she felt uncomfortable, she could refuse. But she replied that she had only been lost in thought for a moment and would gladly dance with him. The girl smiled sweetly and said she was truly grateful that he had invited her for the first dance. Everyone around them started murmuring again when they saw the star of the evening dancing with Sonia. People said the two of them looked very harmonious together. Some even assumed the Archduke had chosen her to marry Gilas. Meanwhile, she noticed how large and strong the man's hands were, hands that could certainly protect someone. She felt a little sad that she still didn't know much about him. The man was handsome and seemed to have a good character, judging by what she had heard. So, if Victor truly wanted them to marry, she wouldn't object at all. And the thing that pleased her most was that even Duchess Winter, once such a grand and striking beauty, was left without attention and without a dance. But the heroine herself was actually quite bored at the ball. She didn't really enjoy parties like this. They didn't interest her. At least she could watch the star of the evening. In her opinion, Gilas danced quite well. At least he wasn't embarrassing himself at his own ball. In fact, she had something to compare it to, because once she had asked the boy to dance with her. He thought it was unnecessary. She didn't need practice. She had only missed a few lessons. But the girl insisted. She said there was only a week left before the ball, and they could practice a little together. She extended her hand to the young man and told him to simply repeat after her and listen carefully to the rhythm. She advised him to be careful not to step on his partner's foot, and that the turns should be smooth. She also told him to always maintain eye contact, since it was an important part of dancing. Back then, everything had worked perfectly. Gilas managed to dance more than well. It had been a good lesson. She told him to look at his partner as if she were an incredible, otherworldly beauty. Now he had followed almost all of her advice. There was one exception. At the end, he didn't look at his partner, but straight at her eyes, and not with the gaze one gives in otherworldly beauty. The heroine was even surprised by how suddenly and coldly he looked at her. Before she could recover, the Archduke began approaching her flirtatiously, slowly drawing out her name. He said that 2 dances had already passed, and she was still sitting there alone. It was such a waste not to enjoy the celebration. He suggested that perhaps no one had invited Evelyn to dance, but she smiled and replied that she wasn't the best partner for dancing, so it was better for her to just sit. The man objected. He said using her beauty merely as decoration would be a crime, even for a widow, so he offered to dance with her. The woman politely replied that he had already given her such a great honor earlier. He said he was sorry she thought that way and immediately extended his hand for the dance. He added that the honor he had given her, as she called it, was only the beginning. Sonia and Gila stopped dancing when she accidentally stepped on the colonel's foot. The girl blushed and apologized, saying she was sorry. It was just that she didn't have much experience yet. But when she lifted her gaze to Gila's, she realized he wasn't even looking at her, and wasn't listening either. Everyone, along with him, had stopped and was watching the Archduke leading the heroine by the hand toward the dance floor. Once again, the crowd began whispering that it seemed a member of the royal family wished to dance with Duchess Winter. Sonia first looked at her uncle, then at the colonel. He had been staring there for quite a while instead of looking at her. And the moment the heroine took her place with Victor in the dance position, the music began. Evelyn intended to simply finish the dance as quickly as possible, but the Archduke started talking to her. He asked how she had been lately, since they hadn't had the chance to meet and talk for some time. The heroine replied, remembering what he had done earlier, that thanks to him, everything was going well for her. He was even surprised by that answer. Then the woman said out loud again about the secretary who had returned barely alive. Of course, Victor replied that he had no idea what she was talking about. Naturally, he wouldn't just confess something like that. Evelyn wanted to say that she simply couldn't believe the Archduke didn't know about it. After all, Isaac had been beaten, and something terrible had happened to the project. But he suddenly leaned her down into the dance. Victor said that talking about business, when they could simply enjoy themselves and dance, wasn't right. He added that having fun could clear one's mind of bad thoughts, so she should just relax. Meanwhile, the colonel and Sonia were dancing as well. The girl complimented him, saying he really danced beautifully. She even said it seemed like he must have taken lessons somewhere and practiced in order to dance like that. But he wasn't listening to the girl at all. He was looking somewhere off to the side instead. Sonia actually grimaced when she noticed. She couldn't believe someone could ignore her. Everyone considered her very beautiful and could hardly take their eyes off her. The man finally looked at her and apologized for missing what she said. He blamed the overly loud music. Just as he was about to ask what she had been saying, they bumped into another couple. The Archduke apologized, saying he hadn't noticed where he was going. And then he looked straight into Sonia's eyes. They had spoken earlier, so that look meant more than just a glance. Sonia understood him. Now she could almost see the logic in why the man might want her to marry Colonel Black. Whether she lost control for a moment, or it was part of the plan, within seconds, the girl stumbled straight into Gilas. She immediately apologized, saying she was tired and her legs had suddenly weakened, so she couldn't keep her balance. Grabbing his shirt, she asked him to escort her somewhere she could rest for a bit after the dance. He looked at her without answering. He seemed slightly irritated, but he still led the girl to a place where she could rest, since it seemed her leg was hurting as well. The Archduke remarked that Lady Sonia seemed a bit nervous, but overall she and Gilas looked quite good together. The heroine said nothing, so Victor added that she herself, by the way, was also handling the dance quite well. The woman replied that indeed she was, hinting that he didn't need to worry about her at all, but perhaps he should worry about Sonia instead. For example, he could go check on her. But the man didn't fall for that. He simply smiled with satisfaction. Rather abruptly, he pulled Evelyn closer to him. He said it wouldn't be a bad idea for them to reconcile already. What was the point of all those quarrels? He explained that he wouldn't want to simply let her go and lose such a wonderful woman. But she sharply pulled away instead, bowed to the Archduke, thanked him for the lovely dance, and reminded him that the song had ended. She added that he should spend some time with the other ladies as well, who, by the way, were eagerly waiting for that. He said that wasn't necessary and that they could dance another one, but she wasn't even listening. By the time he finished speaking, Evelyn was already walking toward the end of the hall, leaving the member of the royal family behind. The man let out a heavy sigh, though he had expected something like this might happen. In truth, that woman was quite predictable. After the dance, the heroine decided to step out onto the balcony. She was very tired from dancing, and there was a reason she walked with a cane. It was hard for her to move so actively. She was in a rather poor state, looking both saddened and exhausted at the same time. She had assumed that Victor would use the dance to propose some kind of deal about the project, but he had remained silent the entire time. Perhaps it was all just to put her in an awkward position in front of everyone. She scolded herself for not realizing right away that he had intended to humiliate her. He knew her legs might fail her. It irritated her that physically she had become quite vulnerable, not like she used to be. Meanwhile, while she was sitting there, someone else came onto the balcony. It was the blonde man who had been shown at the beginning of the banquet. He was heading straight toward the heroine. Evelyn quickly raised her head. She had hoped to spend a little time alone, but now she was being disturbed. At the same time, Hilas had taken Sonia to a room and was already examining her leg. He said she had most likely experienced a muscle spasm. The girl watched him and remarked that during the dance she had realized something. More precisely, she hadn't noticed before just how refined this man's face was. At that moment, he was actually suggesting they call a doctor. She wasn't thinking about any doctor. Instead, she was thinking about his body, his hands, his face. Sonia blushed when another, rather intimate thought suddenly crossed her young mind. She became incredibly curious about what it would be like if he, as a man, belonged to her, if he were officially her fiancé. When Hilas didn't hear a response, he decided it really would be best to call a doctor, and he started to stand up. Of course, when she came back to her senses, she said that wasn't necessary, almost shouting it. She stood up abruptly, but her leg failed her again, and she fell straight into his chest, accidentally wrapping her arms around him. Meanwhile, Evelyn was asked why she was even there. Had the Duchess of Winter really been simply pushed aside like that? She actually wasn't in the mood to talk to this man at all. In fact, she was annoyed that he had disturbed her. Count Theodore wiped his mouth and said that the woman needed to help him, since they were in rather similar situations. Meanwhile, Sonia was still standing in Hilas's arms. She felt a little embarrassed and admitted she felt awkward. She asked him to just stay like that for a moment so she could calm down a little. She explained that it might seem strange, but she actually felt more at ease in his arms. She mumbled that the tie he was wearing suited him very well. She asked if it might be some kind of valuable gift. Anyone could tell she was simply trying to learn more about him. He didn't answer because noise suddenly came from outside. It interrupted their conversation and distracted them. Sonia glanced toward the door and asked who could possibly be out there so late. It was hard for the man to say who it might be without checking, and that was exactly what he intended to do now. The heroine was a little annoyed that someone had interrupted her moment when she just wanted to be alone. Theodore bowed to her and said that, just as expected, she could recognize a person even if she had only seen them once or twice. The man said that when she looked at those people, no matter how flashy they were still far from possessing noble titles. Essentially, the man called them all pigs. Apparently, he wasn't in the best mood. The woman asked him to refrain from using such words, since someone might overhear them and later use it against them. The man shouted that it didn't matter what other people said or thought. He asked whether she didn't feel uncomfortable among everything happening around them. He exclaimed that they had no right to push her out of the ball, especially considering that she was injured. He said she should just listen to what people were saying behind her back. The heroine still didn't answer. It was obvious that this man didn't really care about her problems. He was simply trying to drag her into his own issues so he could solve them. Evelyn only replied that he was drunk and talking nonsense. The man asked whether she was suggesting that they should keep doing whatever those worthless people said. After all, they were nobles. Since he wouldn't leave, Lady Winter said she could simply go herself. But he didn't let her. He roughly grabbed the woman by the arm and said she had to listen to him because he wasn't finished yet. Now he spoke honestly. He said he actually had business with Lady Winter and that she just needed to help him a little. But since the lady didn't appreciate him putting his hands on her, she slapped him. The woman said that everyone already knew he had lost his money gambling, so he shouldn't even try to use her. She added that she wasn't stupid and could see he was just trying to grab any opportunity to get money. She told him to stop staining the honor of the nobility and go sleep it off or something. But the man was already furious and had no intention of doing that. He grabbed the girl's arm tightly and pulled her roughly. The man reminded her that, by the way, she was exactly the same as he was. The woman hissed at him to get lost. But the man continued. He said he had heard about her financial situation. He asked if she had come here to find someone richer. The heroine reacted sharply. She kicked him hard between the legs, making him crouch down, and started backing away. She thought the conversation was over, but he suddenly grabbed her braid and yanked her back. Evelyn fell loudly to the ground with a cry. It hurt. A lot. Now Theodore was simply furious, unbelievably angry at the way she had behaved. He called her a bitch. Theodore said their situations were no different at all, so she had no right to look down on him. When Gilas looked outside the door, he saw 2 servants there. When they saw him, they were nearly scared to death. They quickly apologized and hurried away so they wouldn't suddenly get scolded. Gilas said nothing about it. He knew that sometimes people simply made mistakes and opened the wrong door. The girl standing behind him asked worriedly if everything was all right, since he had frozen and hadn't come back. The man asked her to stay there and rest while he went to get her a drink so she could relax. When he stepped into the hall, he stopped in front of the place where Lady Winter should have been sitting. She should have been there, but neither the chair nor the guest herself was there. That was rather strange. Meanwhile, Theodore loomed over the heroine. He asked why she wasn't screaming. Probably because she knew that even if someone came, she would be the one blamed. That's how it always was. The woman said she didn't need protection from someone like him. She considered him foolish enough to deal with on her own. Theodore said she should actually be grateful that he had created the perfect conditions for them to have some fun without prying eyes. The heroine didn't even want to hear what he was saying, but he claimed that he could see in her eyes how much she wanted it. Just as he was about to continue, the door suddenly opened. He immediately let go of the woman and simply sat on top of her. Both of them looked at the person who had stepped onto the balcony. Lady Winter even felt relieved when she saw the owner of the estate in the doorway, Colonel Black. Meanwhile, Sonia was waiting for the man in her resting room. He had been gone for quite a while. She wondered what he would bring. She was waiting for him eagerly. Would he bring her some alcohol so they could drink together? And what would happen next? Outside, fireworks had already begun. The girl stared out the window. It didn't happen very often, but it looked impressive. Like a fascinated child, she leaned against the window and enjoyed the beautiful view. But when she lowered her gaze, she saw Colonel Black carrying a woman in his arms. Sonia was genuinely struck by the sight, and she had been waiting for him. Meanwhile, beneath those beautiful fireworks, Gilas carried the somewhat distressed Lady Winter toward the carriage. As for what had happened at the banquet, Theodore, as if nothing had happened, asked why the main guest of the evening wasn't at the celebration. Theodore said the spot was already taken, so Gilas should leave the balcony. The man explained that he had come there because the dancing had tired him. He said he truly hadn't meant to interrupt their enjoyment. He even offered to give them a guest room. The heroine looked at him first with surprise, and then as if she wasn't surprised at all. The woman stood up and said everything would be fine if the man who had so rudely interrupted them would simply leave. He replied that this was his residence, so he would decide where to go. If he wanted to stay there, he would stay. She had nothing to answer to that, since overall, he was right. The girl asked in surprise whether his words meant that he actually liked all of this. He didn't give a clear answer. He replied that she didn't seem to be having such a bad time either. Then Evelyn, somewhat out of pride, suddenly kissed Theodore. She did it for show, for appearances, not sincerely. But the man didn't react at all. His gaze remained cold and fixed directly on them. Before leaving, she tossed a few coins at the man. Smiling, she added that with skills like his, no woman would ever like him. Stopping right in front of Gilas, she asked whether such ordinary entertainment was enough to cheer him up a little. From behind her, Theodore shouted another insult, asking how she had even dared to treat him that way. Moreover, he grabbed a bottle of alcohol and threw it straight at the woman. But he missed and hit the wall beside her. He would have shouted a few more insults, but this time the colonel didn't just sit still and grabbed him by the neck. It seemed this insolent man had truly angered him with what he had done. Theodore immediately got scared and asked why the main guest of the celebration, who was lower in rank than him, had suddenly started acting like that. When the girl came to her senses, she heard someone groaning behind her. She cried out, addressing Colonel Black. She said he probably didn't want to ruin the banquet he had prepared so carefully, so he should stop now. She reminded him that he was now the master of the estate and had to behave accordingly. Theodore was eventually released, but he no longer wanted to stay there and decided to escape through the balcony. As strange as it was, he really did jump off the balcony like a madman. Fortunately, it wasn't very high. Everyone below immediately started making noise, and the heroine looked straight at the colonel. Before saying that instead of a celebration there had been real chaos, they stood for a moment and looked at each other. The man simply agreed that it truly had been chaos. When the heroine sat back down in the chair, she said that as the owner of the house, he could go back now. There was no need to wait for her. He had only just begun to speak when she interrupted him and assured him she could walk on her own. But he only clenched his hand into a fist and ironically asked if she really planned to walk on legs that could barely hold her. He seemed quite upset, though overall he was telling the truth. The girl had nothing to say to that. She truly was exhausted. The evening had turned out rather foolish. It was genuinely hard for her to walk. Everyone in the hall had already begun looking for the man, since it was strange that the host had disappeared. But he didn't go to them. Instead, he placed his cloak over the heroine's head. The man knelt in front of her and asked her to show him her leg. He urged her to show it quickly while he began pulling off his tie. To be honest, she was surprised. She didn't understand why he was staying there and helping her at all. Evelyn said that the Archduke was waiting for him, in case he hadn't heard. He couldn't simply ignore him. He didn't answer, only silently felt along her leg and, from her loud cry, understood exactly where the problem was. Then suddenly, the man stood up and lifted her into his arms. While everyone was calling out and searching for him, he ignored them and walked forward with the heroine in his arms. Evelyn asked him not to do something he might regret later, though at the same time she understood that he was helping her a great deal. Since the woman was in bad condition and trembling all over, Gilas asked her not to speak and to calm down. Near the carriage, he ordered the servant to drive through the back gate, adding that there were guards there as well. Evelyn said that Colonel Black was being too kind to her, and if Victor found out, nothing good would come of it. But he cut her off even more harshly, saying it was none of her business. She agreed with that, and then more quietly added that it had been the worst banquet of her life. The man admitted that he shared her feelings and agreed that, for him too, it had been the worst banquet ever. Later, the carriage drove off, leaving him alone. Keela seemed to just walk toward the estate. But in reality, everything that had just happened, the flood of emotions he'd experienced, hit him straight in the heart. As for the heroine, she felt the same. She'd gone through so much in one evening and felt utterly drained. She couldn't stop herself from letting her gaze trace Colonel Black's figure. It was remarkable how their two worlds were divided, from the lively, active, carefree life inside the estate. Only the organizer of the celebration wasn't amused, because he felt as if someone had struck him right in the heart again. In a burst of anger, he even hit the wall with his fist. And she, his former hostess, felt the same. The way he had treated her kindly, unlike anyone else, was overwhelming. It hurt him to realize that he was breaking the version of himself he had carefully polished for so long. And Evelyn was upset that she couldn't be the right version of herself, that she had become weak and vulnerable. People kept talking for a while about Theodore falling onto the terrace. Some thought he'd fallen too far. Others thought the colonel had pushed him. Some defended the colonel and insisted it was the blonde man's fault. But either way, the situation was quickly forgotten. Sometime later, when the heroine felt much better and was calmly playing chess with Oscar, someone came to visit her. Her governess informed her worriedly. She looked quite flustered, and Lady Winter didn't know what to think. She was surprised to hear a guest was coming, as no meetings had been planned. Lately, unexpected visitors hadn't been pleasant. Before the guest was formally invited in, He entered on his own, apologizing for the sudden visit. He wore a hat and kept it over his face for a while, but he was friendly and explained he had been passing by and decided to visit Lady Winter. It was a young prince. Removing his hat, he asked how Lady Winter was feeling now. When Oscar realized he saw a familiar face, he nearly jumped up. He couldn't believe it was him standing there. Oscar said he remembered him as a little boy, and now saw him as a young man. He asked how old the prince was. When the prince said he was 19, Oscar practically exploded. He couldn't believe 10 years had passed and the boy had grown so much. The young man, however, didn't recognize him at all and didn't understand why he was suddenly shouting. The heroine was also glad to see him and smiled kindly. She said that if he had come, he should join them. Oscar gave up his seat to the young man, saying he couldn't finish the game, and offered him to play in his place. The young prince was thrilled, barely believing he could really do it. Of course he could. He was welcomed here not because of his title, but because they had seen his childhood and knew he was a good person. Sitting at the table, Joshua said it reminded him of times many years ago when he had sat in the same spot, much smaller and younger, but with a member of the Winter family sitting opposite him. The young man explained that Sir Rowan had once taught him how to play chess. He remembered that every move was precise, and he could never read Rowan's mind. He was a calm opponent, someone who let him escape his worries. The heroine replied sadly that it was nice to hear, that those were good memories of her husband. Smiling, the prince said he never had a chance to win. Imagine that. In his opinion, Sir Rowan was a true strategist. But there was something else vivid in his memories. The prince said that by Rowan's side, there was always a true goddess of victory. He never even lost at chess thanks to her. Then the heroine said it should have ended long ago, that it showed him in a bad light. Rowan replied that he couldn't even consider other moves. They argued a little there at the table, while the prince silently observed. When they asked him something, he seemed to snap out of a trance. Long ago, the woman had asked him if he wanted to play chess with her, but they never got the chance. And now, here they were, at the same table. He said he had lost count of all the training sessions since then, so that when this long-awaited game with the Duchess came, he would win. Joshua admitted he really wanted to play chess with her now, more than anything. After everything that had happened, Sonia felt a little puzzled and went to speak with the Archduke. Victor asked her to get to the point quickly, as he was quite busy. Sonia then asked if Colonel Black liked anyone. The Archduke replied that it was impossible, otherwise he would know. And Gilas, though a cold person, was still an old acquaintance. The Archduke told Sonia not to worry. There was no one who didn't admire her beauty. But she kept recalling the scene of Gilas carrying Lady Winter. She just couldn't stop thinking about it. Sonia mentioned the rumors that Colonel Black and Lady Winter had been together on the balcony. The Archduke exhaled heavily, as if he couldn't believe what she was saying or why he was even reacting to gossip. But in truth, there was reason to worry. Lady Winter's carriage had disappeared suddenly, and no one noticed how it happened. Only the estate owner, who knew his people and all the exits well, could have arranged that, to remove someone unnoticed. Later, when the game ended, it turned out all that training hadn't helped the prince at all. He had lost. The prince was upset about losing. Oscar blamed Evelyn for distracting him with her stories. The woman apologized and said that if she had already won, she had one question for the prince. He was surprised, as he didn't know anything about it himself. But she asked a fairly simple question: why he had come here without a single servant. By the way, Sir Gilas had changed at his estate, preparing for the matters awaiting him that day. When someone came in, a male voice announced it was from the Scorpion. There was a small note, which he read quickly. Taking his coat, he ordered the man to follow him, without mentioning what was in the letter. On the way, Gilas got himself together, and now looked, as always, rather official. But he was already being met. The Archduke asked where Colonel Black was headed so early. Gilas hadn't expected guests so early, especially not Victor. It was clear he had some business or conversation, since he arrived early to catch him, the colonel. He asked that he and Black have tea at his estate. The colonel stayed calm, but was surprised by the sudden visit. Meanwhile, the prince asked Lady Winter about the Red Hawk Brotherhood, seeming worried as he asked. Oscar clarified, asking if they meant the secret society supposedly planning a rebellion. He shared that he had heard they had been disbanded and destroyed, but the prince worriedly replied that the society still existed. Meanwhile, the colonel told Victor that if he had mentioned it earlier, Gilas could have prepared better. But the Archduke saw no need for formalities. He placed his hand on Gila's shoulder and gently pulled him along, saying they should go inside quickly to have tea. And finally, Victor admitted he wanted to discuss something with the colonel. Meanwhile, the young prince said that neither at the academy nor the castle did anyone tell him the truth. It was clear this upset him greatly, and he had likely come here seeking answers. And the Archduke led the colonel inside as quickly as possible to discuss the matter weighing on his mind. That's how the four of them ended up going for a walk. Oscar said he hadn't been to the market in a long time. Sherry pointed at something, and though she didn't speak, the man understood she wanted something. They ran in that direction, while the woman reminded them they weren't there for leisure. The heroine apologized, saying Sherry was still a child. Joshua said she didn't need to speak so formally to him, and quietly too, so no one could hear. He didn't want Lady Winter's efforts to be in vain. She agreed and suggested they move on. Meanwhile, Victor sat at a table, praising the tea. Gilas replied that he had received this tea as a gift at the banquet. Victor suddenly asked if it had been a gift from Duchess Winter. Gilas just looked at him, so the Archduke joked, saying he had recently heard something. More precisely, Sonia had asked whether there had been anything between him and the Duchess.